Paddy Weston, a local historian and potter, and a member of the Lusk Heritage Group. Paddy tells us a little of himself and his interest in local history.
My memory of Lusk is of a little place with houses that have disappeared at an enormous rate now. You know, I'm talking about I was born in 1927, so I'm talking about 35 and round there before the last war. And there were still a lot of thatched houses then. Those ones that you got pictures of, they date from... There was a survey done by the University Architectural School, wasn't there?
1930s, wasn't it?
30s, yeah. And there were loads of thatched houses still here. Well, Lusk was originally, of course, a mother church, a very important church, before the manorial system or before the Normans came, before the various synods that took Ireland out of the Celtic church period and brought it into more union with Rome. Then they set up various parishes, but before that, before the 12th century, you had little churches situated all around, like satellite churches, if you like, up as far nearly as Skerry. Skerry's Homepatrick and Rush and all came into the ambit of being part of the Lusk Christian area, and out as far as the Meath border perhaps. At points it was a prebendary church. In other words, well, same as Swords. Swords was very significant indeed. Both Swords and Lusk were old style mother churches of the areas they were in. But there were also prebends later on, and after the Norman invasion, very well known that a cardinal in Rome would hold the parish and as is living, and he would appoint a prebend to substitute and carry out the duties of the parish for him. So it all changed with the after the synods and that in the 12th century, and Ireland came into the European environment more than anything else. But there was original...
And the actual effect that we see that in Rush and Lusk and that.
Ah, yeah. Rush went in and out of being part of Lusk Parish. Like there's a very old church in Lusk in Rush in Whitestown, associated with shipwrecked sailors, and how St. Maur came to be the patron of Rush is that it actually he's a Breton saint, northern France. At one point there must have been, there's Connure was another old church in Rush, but the parishes of Rush and Lusk were united for quite a long time. Lusk had a very big church up to the middle of the 19th century. Then of course part of it was blown off, one side of the chancel, and they just used one side alone, and then the whole church was pulled down and the present church was built. This is Church of Ireland, was built around 1849 or thereabouts, attached to a square tower, which is 16th century in origin, and of course the round tower, which was belonged to the original monastery. And if you were in a plane or a helicopter over Lusk, you can still trace the old monastic surrounds of the roads actually follow a curve round, a circle round to a great extent round the... you can view that if you go up into the tower. It's all there showing you exactly what the origins of the place were. So it has a great old Christian heritage, Lusk, and of course it's expanding in population at an enormous rate in the last 4 or 5 years. I remember as a child, the bogies, for instance, was one of the interesting part of the whole harvest scene, was bringing in the hay. They didn't have balers. Well, they had balers, but they didn't bale hay in those days so much. And the hay would be, there would be 2 or 3 bogies, and they would travel the whole way from the centre of the village where the farm was, right down about a mile down to the land, down along the Skerries Road. Turn in the laneway at Peter Gaffney's house there, or Con Gaffney's. And they'd go out to various fields they had where they grew a lot of hay, and a big hay shed full of hay. And then the corn was another thing. That was later. I would be back to school by then probably. It wouldn't be so much. But hay was right in the middle of the summer, July and August. And the making hay was great, you know. They used to bring the tea. They would be so anxious to get the hay done. that sometimes you'd have to work on Sundays, but the men wouldn't work on Sundays unless they got permission from the altar, and the priest would say, "You permission to save the harvest." I remember that kind of it too, because you could get long wet summers too as well. I can remember one long summer that did hardly anything but rain every day, and the men were struggling to make hay. Today they just make silo, but in those days you had to have 3 or 4 clear days every so often, and maybe a week of very fine weather, because the hay would be laid down in swaths after it was cut, and then it'd be turned, and then it'd be put into cocks, and then it'd be brought into the big hay shed. They were old-fashioned methods. Of course, they cut the hay with a reaper. They cut the grass, the hay with a reaper, and it wasn't bound or anything like that. But when they came to cut corn, like wheat and oats and barley, they had to have men open the field. This was when with reapers and binders, before combine harvesters come in. And these men had to be very strong men to work aside. It was very heavy, very hard work, very hard on your back. You'll notice they always had very big wide leather belts to support their back, because a lot of the stress was on their back when they were working the side. And there were local families, local men who were famous for this, and they'd come from Malahide. I remember they come from Malahide all around Donabate. But there were others who came from Cowan, and they were called harvestmen. And they would come up, and maybe a group of 3 or 4 or 5 of them, and they'd live in a vacant house somewhere, belong to somebody, and they'd do the harvest. And this is one of the jobs they did, was working at the harvest, because they needed extra labour at the harvest. And they would work as men to open fields and that, but open round the whole side of the field, so that not to waste the corn, and then the binder and reaper could start and have a clear passage to work round. And then, of course, there was stucking, hand stucking and all that. That was all very, very labour intensive. And then they would bring it in, and it had to be trashed. And the trashing was a very exciting period. It was late in the autumn, and there were no tractors really, very, very few tractors. The tractors were steam engines, big, huge, big steam engines, terrific things, bellowing smoke in all directions and steam, and very exciting. So to come into the village, you would have various families like, there were, I'm trying to think of the names, it was Fitzgerald's and had a tractor, and Harford's up above Swords had a big mill tractor and mill, and would travel around in the harvest time. There was another family down near the Delvin River. I'm trying to think of their names now. But Harford's mill was well known, and Mullally's was another name. And but the steam engine would draw the thrashing engine, which was a huge wooden thing, really, very big. And then behind it there would be a little caravan for the man to live in, the man who looked after the engine and that. And because he'd a long way from home unless he cycled back and forward each day. And behind that there was a straw tire. So you had this train coming into the village. And then there was always the problem of getting in gateways, because the gateways of these farm places, they weren't designed for I can remember several where I lived in Portrand. Every time it came, they had to dig a bit out of the bank, the far side, to get enough turn to get in. And every year this seemed to happen. And very often they knocked down piers in the process, because they were only designed for pony and traps or something like that. But when they got in, they set it all up, and the engine faced onto the thrashing machine, and the straw tire was at the back. It tied the straw automatically. Subsequent to that, there came the balers. The balers were big, long things as well. So a lot of people opted for baling instead of just straw tying, baling the straw. It was interesting, because if you want to thatch a house with straw today, you want to get it that it has not gone through a baler, because it crinkles all the straw. So it has to come through a straw dryer or tied by hand. So people will facilitate men who want to get straw for thatching. So therefore the engine faced onto the track, and a big belt went along, and the whole thing went murmuring around, and there were loads of men. Now, there were some men, we'll say, who were known as men who followed the mill. So if I had an uncle and aunt who had a farm up near Swords, and I can remember the men from Swords, about 12 or 14 men with just, they probably had no work for the rest of the year, or a casual work maybe. And they would all just arrive down to help with the mill, and they would get a little extra money. There was a certain extra amount paid to them for their day at the mill. And they would spend maybe 3 or 4 weeks or a month following the mill, that particular mill, round the area, the countryside of between Malahide and Baldoyle and Swords and that, you know. And as far as I know, a lot of those men, when the mill wasn't there, they might get a bit of work on the council coming up to Christmas. There'd be what they call relief work. But a lot of the time they spent standing at McGowan's Corner. That's opposite the gateway into the castle in Swords, and it was a famous place. Father Lillis once in Swords, he was christening a man and woman's child, and he asked them what name. He said it doesn't matter really, because he's going to be christened at McGowan's Corner later on anyway. The Reverend Reeves, who was based here in the latter years of the 19th century, he was a Church of Ireland minister here. I lived in the Glebe house over where the Walshes live now. He asked to be sent from the north of Ireland, from County Down, I think it was where he was, to be sent down here so to be near source material in the archives in Dublin, in Trinity College and that. And he wrote a definitive history of Lusk, and he also wrote a definitive history of Swords. So it was, a lot of it came from that. He did a lot of the early research. So as I say, I've always been interested in that history. Now, I was born in Lusk 78 years ago, last November. And I don't remember that naturally. My father was in the national movement. He was very early on involved with the foundation of the Sinn Féin and the IRA. And he joined the army, the National Army, after the truce in 1922, and he was a captain for many years. And at that time we lived down in the Commons in a house belonging to my grandfather, my mother's father, McNally. And he used to travel in and out. He was a great man on a motorbike, and he was based in various barracks throughout the city of Dublin. He also did a survey in Kerry after the Civil War was over, and that, where he was in the engineers, and he was had a group rebuilding bridges and various things like that, he told me. Well, I think he became disillusioned with the army, and around 1924, 25, I think he left the army, retired from the army. And he came from a family who were stonemasons, a local family of stonemasons, the Westons. Now, how far back we go, I'm not certain, because some of the Weston families in Dublin go back to the 16th century, and there are families in Drogheda of Westons. But we're one of those. I've never researched them really, either Drogheda or Dublin. We're a Leinster branch of a family that emigrated from Britain. My father used to say we came with Cromwell. I don't know whether that's true or not. However, the Westons have always been tremendously involved in independence movement. As far back as 1798, there were many of them from the Turvey area, Carduff and Old Town area recorded as being involved in the rebellion.